Thank you all for checking out this week's episode. Once again, I'm John. If you like what you heard and saw today, subscribe to our YouTube channel, find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and check out our brand new merch store with hats, coffee mugs, t-shirts, other cool stuff coming down the pipeline. Again, thank you all for support. Be safe, and see you next week.
How's it going, everyone? John here, the host of Spirit Talk, and today we get to welcome the incredible Jackson Rudolph to the show. Jackson is a 60-time multi-world champion martial artist with the Bow Staff. He is a 4-3 black belt in Tae Kwon Do. He's a black belt Hall of Famer. He's also a medical student and becoming a physician through the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, as well as a second lieutenant in the Army. He's the creator of the Flow system with the Bow Staff, and a husband and a very, very busy individual.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and excited to get into all the crazy things that I do in life.
So I think we should start there. It's for someone that is world-renowned, incredible at what you do in the martial arts. How do you find the balance between that, going to medical school, the military commitment with the medical school, being a husband, training and teaching and doing what you do? Is there ever a time in your life where you're kind of like, maybe I'm doing too much? Or what advice do you have for people that want to give advice to people to excel in these situations?
This is by far my favorite question because it is my entire mission statement as a human being at this stage in my life is, we hear so often in motivational podcasts and speeches and things of that nature, you pick that passion, you stick to it, you dedicate all of your time to it. And I feel that because that was a young Jackson Rudolph, 6, 7, 8-year-old me. That is how it was with martial arts because when you're in second and third grade, you don't need to dedicate all your time to school because you're in second and third grade. And so literally very early in my life, that was my mindset of this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on just one thing. And that's what I'm going to be great at because I loved it. It wasn't in the beginning, it wasn't this pursuit of greatness. It was, I love martial arts. And so this is what I'm going to focus all of my attention on. But then as I got older and I had other interests, get into middle school, that's where I kind of first thought that I might want to be a doctor and go to medical school. And so I started to begin juggling passions through middle and into high school. And then really in college is where I hit the ground running with it because it was like, as soon as I stepped foot at Stanford, that was like, everything really matters now because this is what determines my future as a medical student, where I'm going to wind up going to medical school, if I'm going to be able to get into medical school in the first place, because that is not an easy process, no matter what undergrad college you're coming from. So really, as I got into college is where I kind of formulated my new philosophy about this, which is don't let anybody tell you that you only have to chase one passion, because for the last probably 8 or so years of my life, I have chased 2, and so far so good, right? I was the professional martial arts competitor all throughout my 4 years at Stanford. I, continued traveling and competing, and then COVID hit, and that was kind of when I was going into the medical school application cycle, and that's when I kind of pivoted and shifted from being a full-time martial arts competitor to working with Black Belt Magazine, writing articles for them, helping them with several other efforts within the sport karate space. And then eventually making the switch to commentating, like I commentated for ESPN2 at the US Open this year, which is sport karate's largest tournament. And that is all happening while I'm now in medical school. And so for me, I always go back to something my dad would always say, which was, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And that is how I've executed this. I love doing martial arts. I love everything I do in that space. I love going to medical school. I love seeing patients. I love the pursuit of that goal of becoming a physician. And because I legitimately and genuinely enjoy those two things, people say, how do you balance it? But for me, I wake up and I do what I love every day. So it doesn't feel like a balancing act. And I think that is the number one message that I want to spread. And I love that we're opening the show with that, because so often we hear pick the one thing and go for it. But it's like, if you're ever feeling that internal struggle and you don't know which direction to go, try both. And there will be times that you physically can't do both for whatever reason, but at least give both a try, because if you truly love both things, it just might work out.
When it comes to those times where it might be difficult, obviously you have a support system, whether it's a wife or family or friends that support you, but how important is that, having that right system in place to make sure people holding you accountable to what you're trying to do. And if you do need a break or you need to step away and, hey, take a time out, they're going to be the ones to step into that. Because for me, and maybe it's just a man thing where we never want to ask for help. And there's always that stigma of, I can get through this. I don't need a mental health day. What are you talking about? That's so stupid. But sometimes as I get older, it's like you meet people who have gone through some actual crazy stuff, that those mental health days and those kind of days, you have to take them for yourself, but don't be afraid to ask for help and surround yourself with people that will kind of help nourish you and kind of protect you from those type of bad days. So if you can kind of talk upon the importance of having that actual structure around you as well.
Right. I had a similar conversation like this with my wife not long ago. And I think that it's exactly that. You just have to be willing to be open about it, because everybody goes through stuff. Obviously, there's a spectrum of different severities that people go through our normal struggles of life, but everybody deals with something. And I think that first step is just having the openness to talk about it and address it and admit that there's something going on or something bothering you. And really that's the first step, right? And then whatever that support system is, whether it's, in my case, I've got my wife, my parents have always been extremely supportive. So I call and talk to them whenever I need to. I've got a great group of friends. So I've been very blessed that I have a lot of social support systems, but it doesn't have to be through that. I know I've even got friends who like really don't want to talk to anybody about anything like that. And sometimes their best way to cope with it is go and play Call of Duty for 2 hours. You know what I mean? Like, so whatever it is, whether it's a social network that helps you and supports you, or whether it's just like whatever that extra hobby is that helps you just get away from it all, which I'll admit, I've played some video games from time to time. I'm a big NBA 2K guy. Not saying I'm good at it, but I play it when I've got time.
Right.
But anyway, just like having those escapes, and then also having that support system and not being afraid to use it. I feel like so often people are like, I don't want to bother them with my problems. You know, there's bigger issues than this. But like most of the time, whenever I've had buddies come to me about it, it's, you know, hey, let's talk about it for 15 minutes. And that changes everything.
Before we get into like the actual specifics of sports karate, and namely the bow staff, one of the interesting things I love about the martial arts, and I've never had a black belt. I've watched all the movies. I respect the hell out of all the men and women do this. And a lot of the guests on my show, from Rasia Casillas, Lauren Avedon, Keith Cook, Richard Norton, Harinder Singh, all these world champion people, what they do, it's always interesting when they talk about it's what they get out of martial arts besides the physical aspect of it. The idea of hard work, respect, loyalty, determination. And it's interesting when you watch someone like you perform, you can tell that you're getting those points out of what you're doing, and it's showing to other people and kids, and especially in a sport that you're trying to recruit people in to partake in the bow staff and sports karate and keep this legacy going. But those type of things, whether it's hard work or respect, it's a lot of times I feel other hobbies people do, or other jobs or other things, you're not really getting that type of stuff out. But what the martial arts teaches you, it's much bigger than getting a black belt to become a world champion. It's the little things in life that help define you as you move forward when you're well past the age of even doing martial arts, maybe.
I couldn't agree with that more. And I think that what makes martial arts so special is no matter which art form you do, like I came up in Tae Kwon Do, but if you do karate, kung fu, doesn't matter. It's built into the curriculum of 95% of the martial arts schools out there. Like in my Taekwondo school, every belt represented a different principle that we were taught. Like the very first one at white belt was respect. And we were taught from day one, like the white belt represents respect. And then down the line, green belt, integrity and perseverance at red belt, and so on and so forth. But just that direct connection, sure, you can gain life skills like that from other sports, but there's no other sport that's going to be that direct about it and say, if you want to advance to the next rank, not only do you have to learn these parts of the curriculum, but I want to show if you're a white belt, can you demonstrate respect? Can you say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and not just do it because we all do it in class, but do it as a natural part of your vocabulary, as part of your dialogue, right? And that's the first little thing that I noticed from even in elementary school. Like when I was in 4th and 5th grade, I remember adults being like, oh, wow, like you're so respectful or whatever, when I would just say, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. Because other kids weren't taught to do that. Kids that were playing baseball, basketball, football, that wasn't part of how they were brought up. And it was literally ingrained in the martial arts curriculum. And then on top of that, I mean, just within sport karate specifically, but you can do this in any form of the martial arts, the goal setting that comes within it. And then from that, the work ethic, right? Like everything that I learned about hard work and about training to get results that transferred over into my academics, that came initially from martial arts. Martial arts is what taught me, like, okay, these are the things that I need to do to move up to yellow belt. These are the things that I need to do to get first place at my next regional tournament. These are the things that I need to do to be able to win on the NASCA circuit, which is our biggest league, the North American Sport Karate Association. And so at every level of training in the martial arts to competing to being a professional competitor, that was instilling in me goal setting principles and a work ethic that I now carry over into all aspects of my life. And the way that that was just so naturally built into martial arts, it's truly unlike any other activity.
Kind of a two-part question here for you. Obviously, when it came to you start doing Tae Kwon Do, how did you transition into bow staff? And can someone go into sports karate without a basis of, say, another martial arts, whether it's Tae Kwon Do, judo, even karate itself, hapkido? Like, do you need a specific background before you pick up a bow staff?
It's an excellent question, because the people who know martial arts, when I say, everybody knows me as the green bow guy, right? But they find out that I have a Taekwondo background and they're like, well, this doesn't make sense. Like, Taekwondo doesn't traditionally teach a whole lot of weapons. Like, you kick people, you don't pick up a bow, right? Even like the word bow is Japanese, Taekwondo is Korean, right? So like, where does this? So anyway, it started for me because my initial school owner, he purchased the XMA curriculum, which came out in the early 2000s. Mike Chat was the founder of it. And Mike Chat was an all-time great competitor in his day. I think he's one of like 2 people ever to get perfect 10s at the US Open, like all the way across the board. So Mike Chat was a big deal as a competitor. And he was also the first guy to do a backflip in a form. And so he really helped introduce tricking and extreme martial arts to the competitive martial arts scene. And he was one of the pioneers of tricking in general, which now has its own like subculture, right? And so he came out with this curriculum in the early 2000s, and he called it XMA, Extreme Martial Arts. He sold it to schools, and this is early 2000s, so it was like DVDs were like all the rage, right? So it was like this literal binder of DVDs that the school had. And my instructor and his wife learned how to do sport karate from the XMA DVDs. And bow wasn't even part of our curriculum. I had learned chucks, I learned kamas, I learned eskrima, I even learned a little bit of sword. Like, I did everything else, and bow just wasn't part of what we did. But then when they purchased the XMA program, bow was a part of that. And literally one day, I had been working on a kama form, and I was going to go compete with that. And my instructor's wife called me over to the side, and she was like, "Hey, you're going to learn bow today." And I was like, "Okay, cool, let's do it." And I picked up bow and fell in love with it, and then probably competed with it for the first time maybe 6 months or so after that. I had quite a bit of training leading up to jumping into that first tournament. But yeah, so that kind of came out of nowhere, and I just fell in love with it. So to the question of, do you need a traditional foundation in any art in order to start sport karate? Not technically. Technically, you could use online resources and learn sport karate and get the techniques right and be good at it, but I would certainly not recommend it. I would always recommend you need that traditional training first, because at the end of the day, all of the naysayers on the internet who get on YouTube and comment like, "This isn't martial arts, what are you going to do when I pull out a gun?" Right? Like all of those comments. But if you just learn sport karate, they have a point, because if you only know sport karate, you don't know how to do gun defense. You don't know how to get somebody's hands off you, because that's not what sport karate teaches. Whether you're a forms and weapons competitor or you're a point fighter, the technique set is completely different. So I would always recommend learn traditional martial arts first, number one, because that's going to give you that self-defense foundation that really is the whole reason that martial arts exists, right? Martial arts, it's a war fighting thing, right? So right. Being able to defend yourself and be effective in combat is an important part of what we do. That comes from the traditional arts. But once you have that foundation, you can build up from that, and then you can test your skills, test your coordination, test your precision, test your speed, test your technique. Go and test all those things with sport karate, because really that's what sport karate is all about. It is technique development. whether you're using it to see how fast you can strike the opponent at point fighting, or you're using it to see how great of a display you can put on in forms of weapons, you're trying to master the technique of what you do. And that's where the traditional martial arts can evolve into sport karate. And I definitely think that anybody that comes from a traditional background, because I've seen competitors that only learn sport karate and they go out there and compete. The competitors that have a true traditional background, Tae Kwon Do, karate, or otherwise, they always have better sport karate fundamentals when it comes to chop punches and shifting front stances and moving the weapon. They're just more natural about it because they have that foundational understanding. So is it possible to do sport karate without traditional training? Sure, but you shouldn't do it.
Fans of the podcast know I love Keith Cook, Master Hirabashi. He's been on the show 5 times. And when I first had him on here, I was always drawn into wushu and the arts and all that stuff. And then we talk a lot of time, every episode, talk about sports karate. And basically what you said, you need a basis before you can jump in there if you want to take the martial arts seriously. And I love what he would talk about. A lot of times with the weapons in your hand, for you, the bow staff, it's an extension of your arms and your hands and the movement and the way you move. And when I heard that, I went back and watched some of his old stuff. And then in turn for researching this podcast, watching your videos and stuff, they're all over. And it's crazy where it's like how true that is. Like the thing in your hand is just an extension and the control and how would you control it and move it. It's so fascinating that people like yourself or Keith or all these other great weapons masters, Karen Shepard, they could do all this crazy stuff, and it's just your hands. And then here you are trying to become a surgeon using your hands again. And it's just like, it's crazy how all these tools in your hands become like the extension of what you're trying to do.
Right. And that's one of the first things that I was taught as a weapons practitioner. Like literally my first instructor would tell me, mastery is when the weapon becomes an extension of your body. That is a direct quote from my first instructor back in small town Paducah, Kentucky. And so like that was always part of my thought process. And that is what I always tried to achieve as a competitor, is that when I put together a form, I wanted to show that I was in complete control of the weapon at all times. Whether the bow was 15 feet in the air because I was throwing up and spinning 3 times, I wanted to catch it and make it look easy to show that level of control, right? And it's something I tell students about all the time is, you've mastered a technique when other people tell you that you make it look easy. Because making something look easy shows that you're in control the entire time. Back when I first started getting good at sport karate and traveling the circuit, the 720 with a bow, so throwing the bow up and spinning around twice and catching it, that was like the biggest bow move that you could do. And we're talking like 2009. But the problem that I saw with it was, as a 10-year-old, was that no one was doing it clean. Like people would throw their bows super high in the air and then they'd stumble around spinning twice, and then it would look really effortful to catch it. And in my mind, in the way that I had been trained up for everything to be about controlling the weapon as an extension of your body, I was like, well, that doesn't look like an extension of anybody's body. That, it doesn't look clean. And so when I kind of innovated my first, what people would call a Jackson Rudolph style bow form, and I brought that out for the 2010 season, which is really what turned my career around, one of the staple tricks in that form was a 720 that people had been doing for the last 3 or 4 seasons on the circuit. But I did it at a much lower elevation. So I would throw the bow to where it kind of just barely went above my head. Other people were throwing 20, 25 feet in the air because we compete in ballrooms, so it's easy to do that. So I kept mine much closer to me, 2 tight spins, and then I would catch and I would turn immediately and bring the bow to my hip in like a chambered position ready to strike again. And I think that just that, it doesn't get as much love now because there's other elements of my forms that people pay attention to, like different tricks I made up and that type of thing. But really, if you ask me, one of the first things that put me on the map and helped me be a successful competitor, it was changing the way that release techniques are caught, to where it's not just throw it up and catch it because everybody thinks it's cool, but throw it up and catch it in a position that you are ready to engage again. Because if you're going to escape the martial arts to do a performance trick, then when you catch that trick and move on to the next thing, you better be ready to jump right back into the martial arts and be throwing practical, foundational, traditional techniques.
as a kid, like obviously the first time I came in contact with the idea of what the Bo staff was, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Splinter, they would do all this stuff. And it's like, I guess the question is, in terms of recruiting or getting kids or anyone in general interested in the sport of Bo staff, outside of the Ninja Turtle movies or shows and stuff like that, what more can be done to bring a awareness to sports karate from a pop culture standpoint? Is it just more movies and TV shows incorporating it, or is this more of a, like, how do you get out there? Doing these podcasts obviously helps the creation of your flow system, which I want you to talk about. But what more can be done to get the idea of sports karate out there to the masses, besides the people that when they do watch it the first time on ESPN2 early in the morning, I'm blown away. Like when I first watched this this is probably 9-10 years ago. Anytime it's on, I watch reruns. I go down rabbit holes on YouTube. I love the idea of what you guys and girls do with this stuff. And it's like, how do we expand upon that and make sure more people just, maybe they might not want to do it, but just appreciate what these men and women are doing?
Absolutely. I think it does start with pop culture. And I think that a lot of it is hidden. Whereas back in like the 80s and 90s, when karate movies were all the rage, right? Obviously, there were things like the Ninja Turtles, the Karate Kid, right? And then all of like the foreign martial arts movies that came out, back in that century, it was very direct. Like, this is martial arts. This is what the movie is all about. So let's go try this. Whereas now, a lot of the top sport karate competitors, they go on into the stunt industry. That's kind of the most common next career for sport karate competitors. And it's hidden because they're doing the Star Wars stunts and they're doing the Marvel and DC superhero stunts. And a lot of it, Bo winds up in there, right? Like you look at Rey in Star Wars and she's using a bow. That's what she's doing. You look at, they still need to make a Gambit movie, which hopefully they call me when they make that happen. But like Gambit, that's like the perfect bow superhero, right? And then there's always like little scenes where, somebody picks up a staff. And I think there was one in Batman Superman with like the kryptonite staff or whatever, right? So it gets in there, but the connection isn't so easy because you don't know that that's a sport karate person that's coming in and doing the stunt work. It's just Batman, you know what I mean? And so it's not as easy for the audience to recognize where it came from. And so how do we get it out there more in this era? I think social media is a massive tool. Obviously, like things go viral and new sports get new exposure all the time. But even more than that, I feel like it's also going to take a change in the direction of the powers that be in the sport karate space. All of the league owners and tournament promoters, for so long, I feel like all of the efforts have been focused on get more competitors into the tournaments. And so all of the marketing has been to the martial arts schools to get more kids competing in the tournaments, but you're limiting your market size if you're only trying to bring people in to compete. The market is so much larger if instead of focusing on getting more competitors, focus on getting more spectators to watch the people who are the best of the best. Because spectators are always going to give you exponentially more money than the competitors will, right? And so shift those marketing efforts. Don't focus on, hey, you school owners, bring your kids to these tournaments. There absolutely still needs to be some of that. But the majority of the marketing effort should be, hey, we've got the 10 best competitors in the world, the top 2 women, the top 2 men, the top 3-point fighters, whatever it may be. And they're going to be performing for 2 hours competing against each other in this show. Why don't you guys come check it out? Tune into this stream on Black Belt Magazine or wherever it may be, at 9 p.m. or whatever. Like doing that type of marketing and focusing on the spectator and growing the viewership, to me, that's the way we get it to grow. And the more fans of the sport that you get, that's where your inspiration comes in. The more fans of the sport there are, the more kids are going to be coming into martial arts schools, and then they'll make their way through the pipeline and wind up being competitors at the events as well.
Growing up, I remember walking down the grocery store aisles and seeing like the Black Belt magazines, like Richard Norton or like Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris or Gene LaBelle, rest in peace, recently. So for when I saw that stuff, I'd just be drawn into a person with a weapon or doing a martial arts dance or a karate chop. I miss seeing that stuff. I miss seeing the physical print and the ads you'd see on late night television of these competitions happening. And it's like, how do people, again, maybe you've already answered this, but the martial arts in general, I'm hoping that after the last couple of years with people like researching and finding a new love or trying to pass time, fell in love with a martial art or something where it can kind of go back to where it was like, again, like they do those tournaments on like in California, the beaches and all these open tournaments where it's like people are just promoting it. I had a Matt Mask on the show a couple months ago. He's a world famous arm wrestler, and the same type of thing where it's like everyone knows those guys from ESPN2 back in the day, Rob Bath, John Berinsnick, all these people you used to watch, the Pete Webbers in bowling, Jeanette Lee and pool cues and stuff. But those people, it's like that aura lost. It's like trying to promote a sport that, again, people might not understand, but it's just the spectacle of getting people in a room, watching people at the best of what they do compete. It's like, I wish I could go down those shopping aisles and still see those magazines as opposed to 14 magazines on how to make a flower bouquet, which is cool, but I don't need to know how to make blueberry scones for 6th Street magazines. Like, I don't need to.
Right. And that's one thing that I love. So I worked with Black Belt Magazine directly in their office for a year. So a lot of people actually don't know this because it was kind of that weird time warp, like after the COVID shutdown, but like not everybody was comfortable being out in the world yet still. And so during that time, so I graduated from Stanford in the spring of 2020. And then the COVID shutdown was kind of around there. And then as soon as the COVID shutdown ended, a lot of people don't know this either. It takes a full calendar year to apply to medical school. It's not like you just fill out your application and send it in and see what happens. It is a whole process. Like there's an initial application, you send that in, and then some months go by, and then you do secondary applications. And you need to have your secondary applications all typed up ahead of time so that when you get the offer for the secondary, you can submit right away. So you're one of the first people they see. And then you do interviews, and then you can maybe tour the campus. It is a whole year-long ordeal. And so I was going to be doing that for a year, didn't have anything else to do. And I've been working very closely with Century Martial Arts since I was like 15 years old, and we started the Signature Series weapons. And so Century caught wind that I was going to be basically available for a year while I was just sending in applications and writing essays. And they said, hey, do you want to move to Oklahoma City and work with us for a year, basically as a consultant? And I said, absolutely, sign me up. And so I moved to Oklahoma City, really expecting to be doing weapons work, like consulting on the quality of weapons and doing all that. And the first week that I moved in there and I was getting settled in my office and everything, and they were like, so we acquired Black Belt Magazine. And we need some help with it, right? Because they had a few of the original employees from Black Belt Magazine before it had been sold to Century. Bob Young, who's still the editor-in-chief of the magazine, and then Patrick Sternkopf, who stays super behind the scenes, but Black Belt would not continue to exist if it was not for Patrick Sternkopf. So I'm going to give him a huge shout out because the work that he does is incredible. Literally, like all the behind-the-scenes stuff, the social media marketing, all of that. Patrick does a great job with that. But anyway, so those were some of the guys like from the original Black Belt company, and Patrick actually moved to Oklahoma City, and Patrick was still kind of just getting settled as I was coming in. And I said, absolutely. And I didn't realize this until I moved into my office because they did a treat for me. And if you go back and you watch some of the old episodes of my podcast when I was still living in Oklahoma, I filmed those from my office. And there's all these like binders in the back, and it is the actual complete archives of every issue of Black Belt Magazine and Karate Illustrated. Black Belt Magazine owned Karate Illustrated, which I never knew.
Never knew that.
Karate Illustrated, of course, is what had all of those sport karate rankings back in the day. I found a retirement article about John Valera from '99. Like so much stuff, and I never knew that was part of the Black Belt family tree. So anyway, so I was like, karate, like you guys were Karate Illustrated? This is crazy. And so one of my first initiatives in trying to figure out, like, we need to increase the online presence. We want to get the website more views. We want to get our social media presence up. And so being a sport karate guy, my first thing was like, well, hey, you guys have this huge following from everybody that loved Karate Illustrated, which no longer exists. Let's bring some of that back. And so that's when I got with kind of our internal team there. We brought out the Black Belt magazines for karate rankings, which are still active to this day, which is basically an homage to the Karate Illustrated rankings back in the day. And so we really started heavy on promoting sport karate again, and it's been really effective. And so now, like if you go into a Barnes and Noble and you see an issue of Black Belt magazine, there's going to be sport karate featured throughout, and they are starting to feature athletes like they used to back in the day. Back when you would see Richard Brandon on the cover of Black Belt magazine or whatever, you can see that again now if you go into Barnes and Noble or whatever. So I really, really love all of the efforts that Black Belt magazine has been doing to bring those athletes to the forefront once again. And now continuing that effort, because I still work for Black Belt remotely, but really a lot of the people spearheading the efforts. My wife, Gabrielle, now works for them. She basically does like all of the posts on social media. So if you don't like the way something's worded, you can blame her for it. And then also Cody McCart. Cody McCart's been doing a lot of the behind the scenes social media stuff and all the analytics. So I got to give a shout out to those people as well for really helping continue that growth of Black Belt and try to get it back to exactly your point where it was, where these karate athletes are up on this pedestal like other professional athletes.
I do want to say, and it's funny you said that, because before you mentioned your wife working for them, the social media since the start of the pandemic for Black Belt magazine has been so awesome. With now I know Sifu Harinder Singh launched his podcast for them, but like just the post, the engagement, and getting people interested and asking questions and having fun with it. And it's one of those things where social media is here to stay. We just have to learn how to play in that sandbox, and it's really cool when people take what that idea of Black Belt magazine and what it means to so many people and generations to now incorporate that in today's life and how we live our lives on the phone and computer and stuff. And it's just really cool. Again, it's one of those things where it's like before you'd be like, you'd see a post back in 2017 was like 3 likes and no follow-up. Like okay, tell me about why are we celebrating this guy's birthday? Why should I care if I'm not a fan? And it's the engagement and people, and I can tag my friends and stuff because we watch this guy's movies, or we can have inside jokes. It is really cool how social media is going to actually help maybe lead the forefront and bringing this stuff back to the populace.
Absolutely. And that's been a really cool tool to watch some of those discussions, because that was something like we started the morning questions when I was in like my first 2 weeks of working for them. And I don't remember whose idea it was. I want to say it was Patrick's idea. So shout out to Patrick for that. But literally it was as simple as, by the way, Jackson, when you come into work every morning, can you just like write a question and throw it up there? I was like, okay. And so literally like I started kind of safe with like, what's your favorite martial art, right? And then like as things went, we were able to get a little bit more creative and be like, hey, Superfoot Wallace versus Benny the Jet, who you got, right? And so being able to like have those discussions, and obviously like while I'm doing other work, like seeing that Facebook tab go off and then look at all the people debating and everything, it has been really special to see people take a vested interest in Black Belt magazine again, because you're exactly right. When I first started working there, a post would be thrown up and the editing would be meh. And, you'd be like, I got like 5 likes, right? So the growth that we've seen there is crazy. I think when I finished working there on site, I think we got up to a monthly reach that was just under 1 million. But now, like I still look at the stats every now and then, and they're averaging like over 10 mil a month and everything. It's really cool to see that growth.
A question I've always had, you're the first guest I've had on here that's actually worked with the Paul Mitchell team. And how did Paul Mitchell get into the popular? How did he get recruiting and building these teams? Because I've seen the name a bunch, and thank God you're here to talk about this, because I can never really get an answer when it comes to research. Because when I first started, I'm just like, how did the hairstylist guy get involved with martial arts? And like, obviously I started to do a little bit of research, but again, how does someone like that, and the importance of someone like that helps push the sports karate name out there?
This is one of my all-time favorite sport karate stories. So buckle up. If you tune into this show, like just understand I'm a massive sport karate nerd. So I could go off about stuff like this forever. And ever since day one of being a sport karate competitor, I wanted to wear Paul Mitchell. My very first sport karate tournament, I saw Paul Mitchell members on stage competing and winning, and decided that's the team that I want to be on. And I didn't know anything about it, right? Little did I know that they've got the longest tenured, sponsorship in the history of the sport, right? So the way that it all started, Steve Babcock, who's one of the co-founders of the team, one of my dear friends, he was a groomsman at my wedding, and he lives up in Narragansett, Rhode Island. And he was like a semi-pro kickboxer as well as a point fighter from time to time in his youth. And when he was living in Los Angeles, he lived in this apartment complex, and he had this garage that he would train in, and he would leave the garage door open. This is California, it's hot. And he would literally work the heavy bag in the mornings. It just so happens that in the penthouse of that complex or whatever happened to live John Paul DeJoria. And so John Paul DeJoria, one of the co-founders of John Paul Mitchell Systems, obviously, he would stroll down that sidewalk every morning. He would see Steve working out, and they would strike up conversation. And John Paul always thought it was cool the work that Steve was doing. And Steve was just a semi-pro kickboxer trying to get by, and so he would often do like little jobs and everything for John Paul. Like I think he did some handyman work, and when he needed something like a carpet cleaning machine or whatever, he'd be like, hey, John Paul, by the way, I need like, $200 for this carpet cleaning machine. I'll give it right back as soon as I return it and get the deposit back. Like, can I do that? And John Paul would give Steve the money. Steve would always pay John Paul back. And that's a really crucial part of this story. And so Steve and John Paul became friends, that kind of relationship. John Paul helped Steve out from time to time. But every single time, Steve always paid John Paul back. And so fast forward a few years, 1987, and there's a Spider Brand team that has recently collapsed. So Spider Brand was a martial arts equipment company that would sponsor the team by making these like side deals with tournament promoters and saying like, hey, if you let our competitors compete for free, we'll give you 5 heavy bags for your school. And the reason the team fell apart is because there were a few tournaments in a row where the heavy bags never showed up. And so there was even one tournament where the tournament was like, you guys, you don't have a hotel room, you don't have anything booked, like you can't be here. You know what I'm saying? And so the team fell apart. They had a team meeting, and they were looking around the table, and they were like, does anybody know somebody with money? Like, we got to sponsor this team. And Steve raised his hand and was like, yeah, I know a guy. And so he called John Paul DeJoria and explained the situation and said, would Paul Mitchell be interested in sponsoring what was then just a fighting team? Would you guys want to sponsor a fighting team? And John Paul said, you know what, let's do it. I'm going to write you a check right now, and let's get this thing going. And so it was literally the way that John Paul trusted Steve from all those interactions when Steve was just doing handyman jobs, that when Steve called and said, hey, John Paul, can we make this happen? There was no hesitation from John Paul. He was on board. He loved the stuff that Steve did in the martial arts. And now, like, in my career, I've seen John Paul DeJoria make it out to several sport karate events. And that's always super cool to see, just like a casual billionaire at the karate tournament. You know what I mean? But that is the origin story of Paul Mitchell. And again, awesome. That was in 87. So 35 years later, it's still going strong.
Is it difficult for you now when you're the announcing side, you're kind of on the other side of the curtain here for this? Like, how do you suppress your competitive juices when it comes to that? And it's one of those things, because you are so relatively young, I would assume. I mean, age is just a number, right? But for someone to have what you've done and the world titles and the Hall of Fame, all the stuff you accomplished in the martial art, to be that young and to be, you look at you and be like, oh, he's probably injured, that's why he's an announcer. Well, no, he's accomplished everything he could do. Is it weird for you to kind of adjust, kind of push that kind of competitive juices now into like the becoming a surgeon or other goals you have in life?
I think with the commentating, it's interesting because commentating is actually something that I always wanted to do. I remember from watching like the first few US Open broadcasts where I was like in the sport enough to know what was going on and to analyze it myself. I noticed that there was never, and again, this is coming from sport karate, there was never the amount of detail that I wanted. And I knew, well, wait a minute, I can figure out what's going on because I do this. And if I'm somebody watching from home, there's no chance they know what's going on, right? They might think it's cool, but they have no idea what technique is what or any of right? And so that was one of my early inspirations when I was maybe 13, 14. Like, I bet I could do that. Like, I would love to do that. And it just so happened that during the pandemic, I got my first opportunity to do it thanks to Jesse Ray. So Jesse Ray is the coach of Team Next Level. He runs Next Level Martial Arts Center up in New York. He's an absolute sport karate legend. He was a fighter back in the day. And he put together the virtual fight tour. And the whole purpose of the virtual fight tour was to do basically just these, like, it was initially Zoom meetings. They've upgraded to doing like pay-per-view streams now, but they would have top point fighters fly in and, do COVID tests. And then they would have point fights hosted so that people could still enjoy point fighting. And he got to a point where he wanted to do the virtual forms tour. There was a special edition of this featuring forms and weapons competitors. And I'd been tuning into all the shows and doing Black Belt Magazine write-ups on the fights. And so he said, hey, would you want to commentate the forms and weapons? And I said, absolutely. And so it was literally like in a Zoom meeting, and there was maybe 150 people watching, nothing major. And we did it. And I did the commentating for virtual forms tour. And then I was talking to Jesse after the fact, and I was like, hey, by the way, I can commentate some point fighting too. Because a lot of people don't realize this, because I was always a bow guy. Point fighting is one of my absolute favorite things that happens at a karate tournament. I am a huge fan of point fighting. I analyze it. I love it. And so then I got into doing some commentating for the point fighting as well. Next thing you knew, there was a Pro Point event, which was another pay-per-view style point fighting event that Josh Horwich put together out in Atlanta. So I got flown out to go and do that. And so after I do a few of these events, all of a sudden people are like, hey, Jackson's pretty good at this. Let's try to get him at some of the tournaments. And thanks to the efforts of Black Belt Magazine and sportmartialarts.com, we started streaming more tournaments. I got in the move with Mallory Woods as my primary broadcast partner for a lot of the sportmartialarts.com stuff. And then that ultimately led to the opportunity this year at the US Open, where I got to commentate for ESPN, because I guess I kind of became the token sport karate commentator. But so it is interesting. You mentioned balancing that competitiveness. For me, I don't really feel it when I'm up there. Like, obviously, deep down inside, when I'm watching my Paul Mitchell guys on stage, I want my Paul Mitchell guys to win. Obviously, I want my wife to win, right? And whenever she's on stage, I admit it on the broadcast. I'm like, yes, this is my wife. Like, I'm going to be a little biased to deal with it. But with the Paul Mitchell guys, like, I don't really even feel that competitive side, because when I'm commentating, I get this like tunnel vision, and it's just focused on the techniques. Because as a commentator, you're focused on trying to inform the viewer what's going on, provide the terminology, the names of the techniques so that people remember it, right? So like, I always remember watching Olympic snowboarding and them talking about the double mid twist. I've got no idea what a double mid twist is, but I know Shaun White can do it. It's cool, right? And so I'm big on getting the terminology out there. And so you get this tunnel vision on just calling what you see and being honest about the performance. And that's one of the touchier parts for me, is when it's like, because we get kids in the finals. And so it's like, man, when it's a kid and there's something with their technique, and you're like, the right thing to do is to explain to the audience, like, this is an area that this competitor can improve, but also trying to balance that and say it the right way, so that when inevitably the kid and their family goes back and watches the broadcast, they don't feel like they were being bashed, but they understand that it's an area to improve. And that's one of the more delicate things to balance. So really in the booth, I don't feel any of that competitiveness come out. And actually, when it comes to medical school and the pursuit of being a surgeon in that part of my life, it's a good thing to be a little competitive in that environment.
Yeah, of course.
Because that's what it is. Like, to get into medical school, to rise to the top of your class, to get the best residency positions, it is a competition. And there's a lot of students who ignore that to, I guess, avoid the anxiety of that. But I think that's one thing that makes me different as a medical student, is that I embrace that side of it, because I've been a competitor my whole life. You know what I mean? So anytime we're in the anatomy lab, I'm always internally like, I can dissect better than that, doing that type of thing. So I do think that the competitive juices, as they say, from sport karate and that professional career, I definitely think it carries over into my other endeavors. And I think that's a good thing, as long as you know when to control it, right?
Correct.
That's the key.
When it comes to like the bigger world stage, like say the Olympics, like, what's the process? Or are there people behind the scenes that are actively trying to get sports karate into the Olympics? Because it's like, for me, not to knock down the ribbon routines or the javelin toss, but here we have someone with a bow staff is twirling that javelin the whole time versus or doing the sai or the sword. And it's like, how's that any different than the floor exercise with a ribbon? Like, these athletes just exerting just as much calories, do as much craziness with. So it's like, how do you kind of sell that to these committees that are like, oh, that's not a sport yet, but we'll put this as a sport? Like, it seems like sometimes I remember when there was like this big hoo-ha about oh, we might have to take judo out or point karate or Tae Kwon Do out because no one watches, no one cares. Well, back to what you said, you're not putting the right people in there to appreciate the sport.
Right. With the Olympics, it's a weird subject. So there are people within the sport karate community who are making an active effort to get sport karate into the Olympics. I believe that the IOC recognized kickboxing as at least a demonstration sport or something like that not long ago. And that's a credit to the World Association of Kickboxing Organizations, WACO, and Roy Baker, who's now the acting president of WACO. And he's been doing a lot of great work over in Europe to get, I mean, there were International Olympic Committee members at the last Irish Open watching the action and seeing everything unfold so that they could kind of assess if it was going to be a viable Olympic sport. And shortly after that is when we got to hear some of the news about kickboxing being a demonstration sport. And obviously if kickboxing's in, that could open up some things for point fighting. What's also weird is that point fighting is like a totally different sport from forms and weapons, obviously. So like, if you get one, do you get the other? That's kind of up in the air. And so if we ever do get that big shot into the Olympics, I'm all for it because that's the exact exposure that the sport needs. But I've also been of the school of thought that sport karate, at least forms and weapons, the extreme stuff, doesn't feel like an Olympic sport. It feels like an X Games sport. And so I don't market that angle. Right?
Interesting, yeah.
So it's an extreme sport, right? Like if you want to do the traditional karate in the Olympics, that feels like an Olympic sport. Market traditional karate to the Olympics because they keep it limited to the traditional arts. Judo, Taekwondo. If you talk to Herb Perez, he'll tell you that the Taekwondo they do now isn't what Taekwondo should be, but it's meant to be the traditional stuff, right? And that's what the Olympics is because it's a traditional sporting promotion, right? Whereas the X Games is actively trying to embrace all of the ridiculous things that humans can do. And that embodies, you can make an argument, point fighting as well as the extreme side of forms and weapons competition. And so I think it's worthwhile at least asking some questions about, well, what does it take to get involved in the X Games? But I think whichever route you try to go, the number one thing that we need is unity. Because right now, a competitor can tell you, yeah, if you're a forms and weapons competitor, NASCA is the best league in the world because they have all of the best athletes. Right. But if you bring somebody from the IOC to a NASCA tournament and they see 3 judges sitting slouched in a chair wearing some jeans and a t-shirt holding up a scorecard, they're going to be like, are you sure this is legit? Like, we can tell those athletes are talented, but something about this doesn't look right, right? And because there's that lack of professionalism and the lack of unity, right? Like the fact that there's so many different acronyms all around. Like, yes, there is NASCA, and NASCA does have the best competition in North America, but WACO, the World Association of Kickboxing Organizations, they have the best competition in Europe. And then you can make arguments about where's the point fighting better. Is the point fighting better in Europe or is the point fighting better in North America? I think most would agree forms and weapons is it's been around longer in America. So it's much more well developed in America. So NASCA definitely has kind of the stranglehold on forms and weapons competition. However, the involvement of all these different acronyms instead of the National Sport Karate Federation or whatever, just like one thing where it's like, this is the governing body of this. That's just like when the Olympics looks at any other sport. I forget what, I actually wrote a Black Belt Magazine article about this with regards to curling, I believe it was. I was like, curling has one unified professional league. If you want to see the best curlers in the United States, you go and you watch this. We don't have that in sport karate. And so having a unified place where the IOC or the X Games committee can go and see the sport presented in a truly professional manner and everybody in the sport gets behind it and is saying this is where the highest level of competition is, we really need that if we're going to make any kind of a pitch to any committee to get our sport featured.
How fun was it you to start your podcast? And like, if people want to watch it and check it out, like where do you want to direct them to go to? Spotify, iTunes, and stuff like that.
So I'm trying to grow the YouTube channel, and I'm not a YouTuber. So right now the YouTube is just like an archive of all the episodes that have been done, but you can see everything there. So it's just the Jackson Rudolph podcast on YouTube. I highly need more subscribers there, so you guys definitely go check it out. But then we do the podcast live on Black Belt Magazine.
Yes.
So if you just stay tuned to like my personal social media accounts, I always share it up on there whenever we're going to go live. Because of my med school schedule, it does tend to change a little bit week to week. But we do live episodes of the podcast, live interviews. We play games on the show, talk shop about sport karate. And that's what it is. It's almost exclusively a sport karate show. And that's always live on the Black Belt Magazine Facebook. So my personal social media, at Jackson Rudolph 1 for Instagram. That's where you can get a lot of the updates. Check out the YouTube, the Jackson Rudolph podcast, and then Black Belt Magazine Facebook is what kind of officially hosts the show.
It's this has been an opposite episode, Jackson. I love the fact that for a lot of people, accomplishing what you did in the martial arts would be one thing. If I did what you did, I'm gonna drink Monster energy drinks. I'm gonna sit on the beach. I'm gonna twirl broom handles the rest of my life. But for you now to put yourself in a position to serve others as your quest to become a surgeon and do all this unique stuff and helping others, it's a testament to, I wish there's more people in the world like you that kind of had that idea, that vision to just push yourself even further than what you think you've already accomplished. And again, man, thank you so much for jumping on here. Thank you for doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for the kind words. That means the world to me. And again, going back to what I said at the top of the show, do what you love. Like, that is, when people tell me like, I can't believe you're going on and doing this, like, it's crazy how much you do. Like, I do what I love. And, I think when you do things for the right reasons, then the world takes care of you. You know what I mean? And so that's my message to everybody. Follow your passions. Always do what you love. Again, to quote my dad, love what you do. You'll never work a day in your life. That's the motto I live by. And again, thank you for having me on the show. This has been awesome.
Oh, thank you, Jackson. Appreciate it.
How's it going, everyone? John here, the host of Spear Talk. You might not know this, but before I record an episode, I like to break a sweat. And I do that using the Chop Fit. Over the course of the past year, the Chop Fit has allowed me to lose weight, tone up my body, and feel even more amazing about myself. A feeling that you should all feel about yourselves as well. If you use this code, SpearChop10, you get $10 off your order. Once again, use code SpearChop10 for $10 off your Chop Fit order. It'll change your life. Thank you.